Welcome back to another edition of the Kevin Moore Show. Now on today's show, I'm about to be joined by my guest, James Carew. Now James has served as the Planetarium Director of the Neil Armstrong Planetarium in Pennsylvania since 2003. James is also a high school astronomy teacher and co-founded the Space Race Museum in the planetarium's lobby in 2016. Now James also hosts public and private sky shows throughout the year and teaches a 9-week adult evening course with topics ranging from conspiracies to UFOs to the Apollo missions to night sky studies. Now, James is a state section director for MUFON Pennsylvania and has presented at 3 statewide conferences to date. Additionally, he co-hosts the Majestic Ears Only podcast, and he joins us today to present a presentation on aliens on the moon. James Carew, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Kevin. I really appreciate being here.
It's great to have you on. And James, just to begin with, right, obviously we've got quite a bit in your introduction that I read out there. So you're part of the MUFON group, is that right?
That's correct. I'm a state section director for MUFON Pennsylvania, which we cover the central part of Pennsylvania in the United States, and I've been doing that for about 6 years.
Wow, okay. So what is your background? What do you currently do?
Well, my background began, I am the planetarium director at the Neil Armstrong Planetarium in Altoona, so I teach astronomy not only to high school students, but the public, and I do 9-week adult courses each year. Sometimes they focus on astronomy, sometimes conspiracies, sometimes UFO and extraterrestrial life. And we also built an observatory at a local Revolutionary War fort. We call that the Mountain Lion Observatory. And we have a space race museum, and we've got a lot of really awesome artifacts from the U.S. and Soviet space missions. In fact, here in a couple months, we're actually getting an Apollo boilerplate capsule, which is basically NASA made about 30 of them back in the 60s to test different aspects of the Apollo missions, and there's less than 10 of them remaining today. So we've got some really awesome artifacts there. And 2 of my friends and I, Jay and Brock, run a podcast called Majestic Ears Only. It's on iTunes and a lot of different platforms, and that's about conspiracies and the paranormal. So we've got a lot of different things going on.
Okay, that's pretty cool. Now, what is your educational background as well?
Well, I actually wanted to teach environmental science, but at the time I was going through college in the early 2000s, you couldn't actually get certified to teach it here in the States. So I went Earth and Space Science, and I taught 1 year of that. And then this planetarium gig opened up, and so I've been teaching astronomy ever since.
Okay. So, I almost want to say to you, how do you apply discernment with having that sort of background into all the things that are out there for people to consume in the sort of UFO community?
That's a fantastic question. So far, fingers crossed, the way that I've been able to keep myself out of trouble is I will teach everything the way it is recorded by mainstream history. But then a lot of times in class, I'll give my students options if they want to hear different directions. And it's worked out really well. I don't try to push them one way or the other. I basically try to show them all sides of every story, and then they can decide on their own. So, for example, when we learn about the Apollo missions, we'll learn about them exactly as recorded by history, but then I'll also give them options, and I can show them up to 13 different perspectives on them. And so far, it's been really well received. Students are really open-minded. This year for my 9-week adult class, the topic was the mystery of Apollo. So we started the whole way at the invention of the gunpowder, and we went the whole way through the secret space program today. So what I've tried to do, Kevin, is basically show people as many sides of the story as I can, and they just decide on their own.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because there is so much misinformation and ludicrousness out there, in a sense, right? And no one wants to always be the one to say, this is not true, I don't believe it. What do you do when there's a story that's so out there, yet, if you haven't had the chance to research it yourself, which I'm sure on a lot of these stories, it's, you don't have that chance. How do you balance that?
Well, ironically, despite me being a believer in a lot of these things and a lot of these things being in my wheelhouse, I do try to approach a lot of these stories skeptically. And it's kind of amazing how many clickbait stories out there will fool people. Like, for example, around every August, a story goes out on social media that Mars will look about the size of the full moon. And it simply can't happen. The best that we'll ever see of Mars is a bigger bright red dot. But I will have so many well-respected people sending me messages asking all about it. So I'm as polite as I possibly can be. It's good that they're interested, and I just try to use that as a learning opportunity. So again, so far so good. I seem to have the right balance.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, the universe. I mean, it's just when you consider the vastness of it, the infinitiveness of it, you know, it does open the ideas of, you know, that there has to be more, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. But there is a balance as well with obviously where we're at with our science as well right now. But what has been the sort of leading sort of authors that have sort of shaped your direction into the work that you're doing right now from the UFO community?
That's a great question. Whenever students or adults who have an interest in it ask me about book recommendations, I think my single best hands down recommendation, it's just the best all around UFO book that I've read, is Alien Agenda by the late Jim Marrs.
Oh,
it's
yes.
absolutely fantastic. And then I also have a lot of interest in archaeoastronomy and earlier times. So obviously Eric von Däniken or Philip Coppens, Graham Hancock, any of those. And I was also lucky enough to be able to meet and present at a conference with Nick Redfern. And
Yep,
he's just an amazing guy, awesome backstory. And I also encourage people, what I like about Nick's books, diverse variety of topics, and it's a very easy read. So if you don't know something about one area and you at least want to be moderately versed in it, I always recommend Nick's books. It's a great way to get started.
Yeah, yeah, of course. And some of the names you've mentioned there are you know, good people. I know Nick as well a little bit, and a very nice guy. Yeah, and I do like his books as well. So obviously you've got a presentation that you're going to give. Just talk about the presentation that you're about to give, and also what is the angle of your work as well?
Sure. So I think I kind of take a hybrid approach, which is what makes me unique. I have a strong background in space exploration. I founded our Space Race Museum. I've collected a lot of artifacts with a colleague of mine over the last few years. And so I have a background in traditional astronomy, an emphasis in space exploration. But then with my work through MUFON, I can also tie in the UFO aspect. And so I think that there probably are a number of astronomers out there that are more well-versed in specific areas. But when you really want to talk about a jack of all trades, I think that's really where my wheelhouse is. The actual presentation I have for you started years and years ago. I wanted to do something fun around Halloween for my high school astronomy classes to give them a little bit of a break. And so I called it Aliens on the Moon and Mars. And so it's about 40 slides. I think I can go through it pretty quickly. And it was basically just to give them a sampling of some of the unexplained photographs and videos that we have out there through the last 40 years of our exploration of the Moon and Mars. And then I basically just let the students decide on their own.
Amazing. Okay, this is going to be interesting. Now, just before we start as well, stitching. I know Zechariah was an influence to you as well. How big an influence was he to the work that you're doing now?
Well, it's funny you mention that because I just did a webcast yesterday where it was a different presentation where I did the history of Planet X or Nibiru. So Sitchin really comes up in a number of areas. You probably know that he, along with Eric von Däniken, we tend to see as the origin story for ancient aliens. And so what fascinates me and why I think Sitchin is so important is he really did some of the first ever translations of Sumerian cuneiform tablets, which is really that oldest form of writing we know of so far on the earth. But it's also somewhat controversial because there's really only a handful of people on the earth that can actually read ancient Sumerian cuneiform text. So there aren't as many people to check his work, but I really find it fascinating, and I really respect people that just think out of the box. And I find that if you look at the history of science, where we really slow down at, Kevin, is when people stop thinking out of the box. So that's why some of these people are such big influences to me.
No, I get it. I get it. And okay, with stitching as well, just keeping on that thread, obviously the Meldek. Let's just talk about that just before we begin the slide presentation as well, just so that we know some
Sure.
of the words that we're going to use. What is Meldek? What do they presume it was?
Oh, so with Sitchin's translations, there's one particular cuneiform tablet that draws a lot of interest because it appears to show a sun-centered or heliocentric solar system, which nobody in the world should have known about at that time. So when we are talking about Sumeria for your viewers or your listeners, we're looking around 4000 BC. And prior to the discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which goes back about 10,000 BC, the Sumerians were assumed to be the oldest site. And so Europe doesn't really embrace the idea of the sun-centered universe until probably about the time of Nicholas Copernicus or Johannes Kepler. So we're looking at 1600s. So the Sumerians seemingly knew about that a good 5,600 years before that. And curiously, even though humans should have only known out to the planet Saturn, because that's really the last one you can see with the naked eye, the Sumerians actually had a 10 to 12 planet solar system. And most of the planets that they show are somewhat correctly scaled to what we recognize the planets as today, except for one. There was one larger object in the outer solar system that initially they associated with their god Marduk. And according to Sitchin's translations, Marduk actually collided with another object orbiting our sun, and basically that formed Nibiru. And so according to his translations, it was a companion to our sun on a very long elliptical orbit, and it would loop through approximately every 3,600 years. And curiously, it does seem like around every 3,600 years, we have increased periods of volcanism and earthquakes on the Earth. It dovetails really, really nicely with the great flood stories we have throughout the world. Mm-hmm. So I think it's just absolutely just a fascinating topic.
But why, can't we see them? Why is there no proof that the planet X is out there, through mainstream science?
Well, that's a really good question. Right now, ever since 2011, there has been a renewed search to find it. Two famous astronomers at Caltech named Mike Brown and Konstantin Batygin basically proposed a model. And the only difference between mainstream astronomy versus those who follow Zechariah Sitchin is the mainstream doesn't believe that the orbit of this planet 9 is going to come very close to the sun at all. So to your question, Kevin, the reason that we can't easily find it is if something is that far out in the solar system, very little sunlight is going to be reflecting off of it. And some people have even re-examined Sitchin's work and believe that the object might not actually be a planet, but what we would call a brown dwarf, which is basically the gray area between a big planet like Jupiter versus a very small star. And so brown dwarfs actually mostly radiate in the infrared or heat part of the spectrum. And so visually, it would be very difficult to find something like that. About the best we could use are infrared telescopes, and there's a lot less of them out there to find it.
Yeah, absolutely. In the times that we're in right now, obviously we're taping this interview and obviously we're all on lockdown. Coronavirus is the thing that, our health systems throughout the world are fighting. And it, kind of puts into perspective, what difference does the UFO subjects make in our lives in a sense? I mean, if they're out there, great. There seems to be proof that we've been visited before, but what difference does it make in our lives when we have a common, threat like we have right now, in a sense?
That's a great question. I often tell people that I think if we knew about it, a lot of the problems here would seem so much less significant. And I really think one of the only ways we can sort of come together as a planet and different groups of people is once we realize somebody else is out there. Because so far, officially, at least to the public, Kevin, we are basically it. And so I think so many people basically will walk around with blinders on. And so we spend all this time just fighting each other over these teeny tiny differences. Whereas once that veil is finally lifted or that curtain open and we realize that we're part of a bigger cosmic community, I think it's basically going to set everything right here on the Earth, or at least as close as we can get to harmony that we can have.
So, James, would you say that modern day astronomy needs to have a bit of a paradigm shift?
Oh, and I always tell my students it is amazing the paradigm shift we have seen in mainstream astronomy, even over the past 5 or 10 years. As recently as 2010, if you were a well respected astronomer and you made a claim that there was extraterrestrial life out there, it could have potentially been a career ender. But as we've discovered so many extrasolar planets, most astronomers have now come along to the idea that the universe is really teeming with life. The only sort of stubbornly frustrating aspect is they still want to poo-poo UFO sightings and make fun of people that have had experiences. But I think it's really only a matter of years before that wall comes down as well. So I do think we're really, really close.
What's some of the most interesting, or one of the most interesting stories that you've covered locally through MUFON?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, maybe a lot of people might not know about it in the UK, but even though everyone's heard of Roswell, there is a famous UFO crash in Pennsylvania, and it was called the Kecksburg Crash. Are you familiar with it?
No, tell us.
Oh, so this was actually December 1965. An anomalous object was spotted basically zigzagging across the Midwestern United States, leaving a green trail of sparks behind it. And it came down in the woods outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in a little hamlet called Kecksburg. And the people who got to it first reported seeing an acorn-shaped ship with a raised rim around it and what looked like weird hieroglyphic writings all around the rim. And the local fire company had actually gotten there as well. But very quickly, the military came in and they pushed all the townspeople out and cordoned off the whole area. And they claimed that nothing was there at all. But a few hours later, the townspeople saw a huge flatbed truck heading out with a tarped object behind it, and that became known as the Kecksburg Crash. So it's a fascinating story because some people think it might be a UFO. Some people actually think it was one of the Soviet space probes to Venus called the Venera probes, where there was a malfunction and it came down, and so the Soviets quickly rebranded it a Cosmos 98 probe, which was actually just a communications satellite. Some people even think, Kevin, that it might not have been UFOs, it might not have been the Soviets, but this was actually an extension of the Nazi Bell or Haunebu technology that they were working on during World War II. Because right at the end of the war, both the US and Soviet Union were vying to bring those top scientists here. And here in America, we called that Operation Paperclip. And these Nazis were actually made American citizens and essentially began our space program. So long story short, it's a fascinating account because there's so many different possibilities. So to your question, about a year ago, I had what was called a historical case. So sometimes in MUFON, people don't report sightings right away. They might wait years or even decades before they're comfortable. And so this man from the central part of Pennsylvania reported this sighting to me. And he said that he and his sister were driving home one day, and it was still daytime, around 4 p.m., and a lot of people were pulled off on the side of the road. So they pulled their car off too. And above a power line above the clearing, he said there was an acorn-shaped object just hovering there. And he said it wasn't working properly. And so sarcastically a little bit, I said, well, how's an acorn-shaped ship supposed to work? And he said, well, you could just tell something was wrong. He said it was kind of listed over sideways and it was shooting out sparks, and then it just kind of shot off and disappeared. And I said, wait a minute, when did this happen again? He said, well, I don't know the day, but I know it was around December 1965. And I thought, wow, that's the same exact time as the Kecksburg crash. So personally, I don't think it was the same exact day, but I found that account fascinating because I thought to myself, what if the United States was testing out some really advanced technology at the time, potentially anti-gravity, but they didn't have all the bugs worked out, and then a couple days later, one of these actually crashed outside Pittsburgh. So I'd say that's probably been the most interesting case. Some of the other ones I get, Kevin, I've listened to some of your interviews, and I know that you've had a lot of experiencers on, and you talk a little bit about alien abductions. We don't actually get a lot of those cases in MUFON, but sometimes people will basically report a close encounter of the first kind to me. And they'll say they basically went outside and they got very close to this object And then they basically walked away from it as the object disappeared. So as a field investigator, you never want to put ideas in people's heads. But one thing that I've asked that seems to work is I'll basically say, do you have a conscious recollection of seeing this object, approaching it, and then walking away from start to finish? And always on the other end of the phone line, because most of these interviews are over the phone, there's always a pause, and then people usually say, no, I don't. And there always seems to be an element of missing time. So I've had at least 3 cases so far that started out as very straightforward close encounters of the first kind, just a UFO sighting, but they end up unearthing some repressed memories, and the potential is there of an encounter of the 4th kind.
Yeah, those repressed memories are very interesting. What they are, we don't know still. Do you know what I mean? I mean, even putting someone through hypnosis, there's still some suggestion there, but what they're tapping into, if it's not a real sighting, what they're tapping into, who knows, right? The part of the superconscious mind or whatever it is, but it's fascinating stuff. And, you know, I've had my own UFO experience where, you know, we did see something, but do we ever talk about it? Can I explain it? Absolutely not. But it was something out of the perception of my reality that I've ever experienced before. Do you know what I mean? But
absolutely,
yes.
And it's.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say it's fascinating too, because you'll actually talk to a number of people who do seem to have some missing time, and they actually don't want to even get into it. They don't want to be hypnotically regressed because they don't actually want to know what happened then. So right. For some people, it can be a very upsetting experience.
Right. Absolutely. Okay, well, we've got your presentation to go over. But just before we do as well, your website is?
Oh, we have a couple different websites. The best one, if you just go onto Google and type in Majestic Ears Only, that's a lot easier than reading off the URL. That is actually the website for our podcast that we do, Majestic Ears Only. So I think that would be best. Thank you for asking.
Okay, well, we'll link that below along with MUFON. I'll link one of your previous we'll link some of your podcasts below. That's what we'll do as well, so people can go directly to them. Okay, well, the floor is yours for the presentation.
I appreciate that, and we are about a half hour in, so if it's cool with you, Kevin, I'll just do the first half on aliens on the moon, and if you want to go a little long, we can add the Mars half. If not, we can just cut it off right there. Is that cool with you?
Absolutely.
Excellent. So let's get going through this, and anytime you want to interject at all, Kevin, please do so. So a lot of people have never heard about the Robertson panel, but this was actually convened back in the early 1950s, and this was still a good 7 to 8 years before the U.S. or Soviet Union would put the first human beings into space. But already the United States could sort of see the direction that things were going, and so they convened this think tank of scientists and military officials. Here in this picture, you can very clearly see Albert Einstein. Some research says that he was part of the panel. Some say that he just basically popped in and out. But they came to 2 really surprising conclusions here. Number one, they said it was very likely during our exploration of the inner solar system, Mercury, Venus, Mars, the moon, Mars's moon, we would be very, very likely to find remnants of ancient civilizations that were on these bodies. And their second conclusion, they believe the best course of action was to keep this totally secret from the public because we, as the regular populace, would not be able to handle it. So some people believe that governments of the world are still acting under the guidance of the Robertson panel to this day. So our moon itself, or Luna, is very much an anomaly. There's actually over 160 moons in the solar system, and ours is about the 5th largest. And the only 4 that are bigger actually orbit around Jupiter and Saturn, which are much, much larger than the moon. And so there's still a debate, even in mainstream astronomy today, how an object as relatively large as the moon could orbit the Earth so perfectly as it does. And so right now there's about 4 leading hypotheses on how the moon actually came into being. But so far, mainstream astronomers have major issues with all 4 hypotheses. So the leading theory right now is actually a combination of two different ones, the capture hypothesis and the large impact hypothesis. So the leading theory goes that billions of years ago, when the Earth was still molten, an object probably about the size of Mars would have smashed into it, and that would have broken a piece off, and then that became the moon. But there's even problems with this because, number one, we can't really find a large enough impact site. And number two, even if you say, well, it was billions of years ago, the Earth's crust has reformed since then, the moon is actually layered very differently than the Earth is. And the Apollo astronauts even brought back some elements and minerals on the surface that we don't have here on the surface of the Earth. So another theory that's actually gaining in popularity is that the moon was actually brought here from somewhere else. And so anytime we suggest an idea of a hollow moon or a hollow Earth, right away that usually likens up imagery of people wearing tinfoil hats. But this actually has been suggested by some fairly credible astronomers, including the great Edmund Halley. Back in 1692, he first suggests a hollow Earth. By 1901, H.G. Wells, who along with Jules Verne, I think is one of the forefathers of science fiction, first suggested a hollow moon. And then it really hits mainstream astronomy by 1970. The Soviets, in a lot of ways, were a lot more forward-thinking than a lot of their Western colleagues. So Michael Vassin and Alexander Shibakov actually published an article in the Soviet Academy of Sciences called "Is the Moon the Creation of Artificial Intelligence?" And this somewhat neatly ties up a lot of the open questions that we have out there about the four main hypotheses. So surprisingly, even though it might sound outlandish at the beginning, we do have a lot of evidence that the moon is largely hollow inside. On at least two different occasions during the Apollo missions, which sent astronauts to the moon, NASA actually intentionally crashed pieces of either the Saturn V rocket or the descent or ascent stage of the lunar module back into the moon. And so this first happens on Apollo 12. And so the idea here, Kevin, was they wanted to see if they could actually activate the seismic sensors that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had left on the moon on Apollo 11. And so they actually crashed the descent stage of the lunar module back into the moon. And the moon actually shook for a good hour, which really shocked them. So by Apollo 13, for any of you who have seen the Tom Hanks movie, fantastic movie, there's a problem on the way to the moon, so they can't actually land. But that didn't prevent NASA from doing some science on the way. They actually had the crew redirect one of the spent stages of the Saturn V rocket, which was still following the capsule, into the moon. And to their shock, it actually rang like a bell for over 3 hours. And the only way this is really possible is if there's big hollow areas inside the moon. In fact, this became such a big deal that in 2013, NASA actually sent a pair of space probes to the moon called the Grail to actually map out the interior areas of the moon. So for some reason, there are large pieces of the moon inside that do appear to be hollow. The other thing we have inside the moon that's somewhat puzzling to astronomers, you can see the gravity map of it right here. These areas you see in red are called mascons, and that's actually an abbreviation for mass concentration. They actually found these quite by accident, first on Apollo 8, which was the first manned mission to at least orbit the moon. And they found that whenever the command and service module went over these areas, their gravitational pull actually disrupted the orbit. So if you match up the mascons with the visible image view, you can see a lot of them are right at the center of these darker areas on the moon, which are called mare. It's actually Latin for seas, because centuries ago, before the telescope was invented, people actually thought that these were oceans on the moon, just like we have on the Earth. And so the mainstream theory is that these are sunken, basically magma chambers. But some people believe that these are not at the right depth for magma chambers. And so hollow moon proponents would say these are basically the remnants of whatever was used by an advanced civilization to essentially hollow areas of the moon out inside so that a more advanced civilization could essentially use it like a monitoring post of the Earth. So we've got hollow areas inside, and we also have mask-ons. So even before the telescope was invented, Kevin, astronomers from around the world were seeing odd things on the moon. So officially we're told that the moon is geologically dead, but observations definitely show otherwise. In this top image here, you have what's often called TLP, which is transient lunar phenomenon. They're bright outbursts of light on the surface of the moon. Now, skeptically, some of these clearly might be meteorite impacts. In this picture in particular, it might just be a meteorite that happened to hit at the moon at the exact time somebody was photographing it. But for centuries, we also have reports of bright lights coming and going on the moon, brightly colored clouds of gas erupting up out of the surface of the moon. And ever since the Apollo astronauts put seismographs there, we also have thousands of moonquakes every single year. And so this really flies in the face of the mainstream theory that the moon is geologically dead. All right, before I get into some of the creepy pictures, Kevin, do you have any questions or comments, anything to add for the first couple slides
No,
here?
you're doing great. That was fantastic. Thank you for this. It's really interesting.
Oh, excellent. So it's not just the United States that's seeing odd things. In anticipation of their own potential manned landings, the Soviets were also photographing the moon, and this is on the lunar far side. So very quickly, let's just do a quick aside to talk about the near and far sides of the moon. There's technically not a light or dark side to the moon, because as the moon orbits around the Earth, it actually is slowly rotating. So over the course of a full month, every part of the moon does get lit. But what we do have, Kevin, is a near side and a far side to the moon. So whenever we look up and we see the man and the moon, that's the side that always faces us. And every single official Apollo mission has landed on the near side. But there is a side facing away from Earth at all times, and that's called the far side. And that's actually where this was photographed. So this became dubbed the Tower of Babel. And the really shocking thing about it, based on the curvature of the moon that you see here, they estimate that it's at least 22 miles high. So even if this has nothing at all to deal with extraterrestrials, it basically shows us that the moon's surface is not purely weather-beaten over billions of years like we're told. And yet, curiously, this object officially has never been rephotographed ever since. So this was called the Tower of Babel. The Soviets also were way ahead in landing unmanned probes and even 2 lunar rovers on the moon before we could. And so these, what you see here, are some of the first ever surface shots. This is from the Soviet Luna 13. So just a couple things to explain. This, what you see right here, is actually an instrument arm of the probe. And over here, you can see a shadow of the probe as well. But then we have 3 anomalous objects out on the surface. Now, initially, Kevin, when I saw this photograph, I assumed that these were pieces that the space probe was basically jettisoning, shooting down or dropping off as it got close to the surface. So what I did next is I looked for as many blueprints and diagrams of Luna 13 as I could. And so I think this piece that you see right here, if you can see my cursor over there to the left, I think is a pretty close match for this small heat shield right here. But I haven't found anything yet that sort of matches these 2 other pieces. So the Soviets are not only photographing odd things from orbit, but also on the surface as well. Now, this picture is a Soviet picture, but it's actually in the NASA history page. And if you look really, really closely, down here in the lower right, there's an anomalous image that's sticking up off of the surface. So one of the theories out there is some people believe that the Apollo missions actually photographed shattered glass domes which were left on the moon. Richard Hoagland and Mike Barra actually wrote a lengthy book called Dark Mission, and they were big advocates of this. I'm sort of on the fence with it, but very clearly here you see something sticking up off of the moon that looks somewhat translucent in nature. And it's not just the Soviet Union that's seeing things here, Kevin. This is from NASA imagery. This was Lunar Orbiter 3 in preparation for our own manned landings. And so it photographed what became known as the Tower and the Shard. Now, here's a close-up picture. I'm a little bit more skeptical on the tower. A lot of people claim to see a lot of geometric shapes back here. To me personally, this looks like more of a lens flare. But the shard is definitely there, and you can even see a shadow coming off of it. So not to put imagery in anybody's mind, but whenever I look at this, it almost reminds me of the Moai, those large stone heads found on Easter Island. So despite the moon supposedly being very, very weathered down over billions of years, both the US and Soviet Union are seeing odd things sticking up off of it, and then there's literally no follow-up to it. So before we even get to the moon, astronauts are starting to see things just in Earth orbit. This is a UFO photographed on Gemini 4. Here we have one photographed by Gemini 7. And for those of you who are watching or listening and might not be familiar, Gemini mythology stands for the twins. So these were basically two-man capsules. The astronauts sat side by side, and they orbited around the Earth, and they figured out a lot of the things that NASA would need to know to actually send men to the moon, like rendezvous and docking and spacewalks and computer guidance. All this was done on Gemini. And then here to me, Kevin, is one of the most spectacular UFO sightings from Gemini. This is the last Gemini mission. This is Gemini 12. Now, I think if we photograph something like this today, you could argue that it was a spy satellite or a piece of space debris. But there shouldn't have been anything like this in orbit around the Earth back in the late 60s. Satellites were still in their infancy. So long story short, even before we get to the moon, astronauts are already photographing anomalous objects which can't be explained. So on to actually the moon itself. Once we started to send men there, this is a very odd picture that you see here to the left. This was actually from the Soviet Zond mission. And what we see here, if you can see my mouse, this line right here is the Terminator, which is basically the day-night line. And then curiously, right along here, you see what appear to be thousands of lights. Now, keep in mind, this is actually on the lunar far side, which we can't actually see from the Earth. And I thought, that just looks spectacular. What could these possibly be? What does the mainstream say about them? And the only official explanation I've found is that these are officially glue marks. So according to NASA, somebody at some point had glue on their fingertips, touched the photograph, and then the photograph was re-photographed, including the glue. But it is kind of curious that all the glue marks are circular in nature, and they all lie right along the Terminator there. This is kind of one of the creepier objects that astronauts photographed. This is from Apollo 10. So Apollo 10 was the final dress rehearsal before the actual manned landing on Apollo 11. So here they actually went the whole way to the moon. They separated the lunar module, and they got within a couple nautical miles of the surface, and then they came back up. But this object was actually photographed, curiously, floating above the moon. And they believe that because it was photographed multiple times and the surface of the moon was changing beneath it, leading to the impression that it was actually up above the moon. And so it became dubbed the castle. This kind of leads into some legend and lore. One of the first ever presentations I did at a MUFON conference was about the mystery or the urban legend of Apollo 20. The idea that after Apollo 17, the last official mission to the moon, the US and Soviet Union actually had joint missions together. And so this was actually photographed on both Apollo 8 and Apollo 15, and it appears to show a long anomalous object lodged into a crater on the far side of the moon. We also have a number of former NASA employees that have actually come out and said very publicly that their job was to actually airbrush images out or objects out of images that would have been too upsetting for the public to see. And there's been a number of people that have actually come forward to say that. And even online today, some basic image searches can show you areas that appear to be airbrushed, not only from the surface of the moon, but actually from the surface of Mars. This is Miss Donna Hare, a former NASA employee that's come out and said this publicly. And probably in your neck of the woods, a lot of people are very familiar with the brilliant Scottish computer hacker Gary McKinnon, who over a period of a couple months actually did the biggest computer hack in history. So he had hacked into some CIA and Pentagon computers and NASA computers, and not only uncovered what appeared to be the existence of a secret space program called Solar Warden, but he recalled actually finding two different file folders, one with original NASA imagery showing UFOs, and then a second file folder where all the UFOs were airbrushed out. One of the only really frustrating things about McKinnon's case is he didn't actually save any of the information. He said he was just so interested in learning the truth for himself that he didn't actually save it. So a lot of people don't realize we actually almost lost Apollo 10 out at the moon due to a UFO encounter. These astronauts almost didn't make it back. And what's really exciting about the clip that I'm going to show you, it actually shows the UFO that was photographed by the astronauts. So just to give some of your viewers a background, this is essentially the three-part Apollo ship that always went to the moon. This back piece right here is called the service module. This contained all of their breathable air, their water, their batteries, their life support. And so on their way to and from the moon, they would be in this cone-shaped command module right here. This is actually the only piece that would come back to the Earth with the astronauts. And then when they were in lunar orbit, one man would stay inside the command module, and then the other two would climb into this spaceship you see to the right, which is called the lunar module. And so these are always the astronauts that would become the most famous during the missions. So for example, on Apollo 11, everybody knows Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, but very few people remember Michael Collins because he's actually the man that stayed inside the command module. Okay, so for the video, the lunar module has separated from the command module. They're about to re-rendezvous, but suddenly the radars in both ships go out due to a very mysterious reason. So, Kevin, just give me 1 minute. Let me try to cue up this video clip that I have for you.
As his craft drifts above the command module, Cernan's camera captures something below him. What looks like another spacecraft.
All right, so that was a clip from NASA's Unexplained Files, which is on the Science Channel, which is absolutely awesome. And that was Bill Burns at the end who was speaking. I've presented with Bill a couple times. He's a great guy. And so that was actually a time where we almost lost an Apollo mission out at the moon, in part because of a UFO. And what's curious about this, Kevin, is as soon as the UFO disappeared, the guidance computers, the radar came back on, and both ships were able to dock perfectly. And so because it was so public, NASA had to say something. So their only official explanation, they simply called them moon pigeons. And there you can see it highlighted right there. So by Apollo 11, one of the big urban legends here is that the astronauts encountered UFOs multiple times. On their way to the moon, and this one's public and fairly famous, they saw an object trailing behind them that was tumbling and appeared to be changing shapes. Sometimes it appeared like a hollow ring, other times it looked like an open book. And the astronauts assumed it was actually a spent stage of the Saturn V rocket, which was still trailing them due to momentum. And so they radioed down to Mission Control, and Houston said that that stage was nowhere near them. So then when they were on the moon, the urban legend is that ham radio operators were actually able to tap into NASA's secure channel. So NASA has a couple different radio channels during these missions that they could use to communicate with the astronauts. There is a public channel, but then there was also a secure channel. And there was a good 2 minutes of radio silence where the public hears nothing at all. So allegedly, ham radio operators tapped into that channel, and they say that they described hearing Armstrong in a panic because there were disc-shaped ships actually parked out on the rim of the crater watching them. And so the legend goes, this is why the moonwalk happened a couple hours earlier than expected, and why Neil and Buzz were only on the surface for less than 2 hours. So just imagine being these two men, not only doing this first, sitting there unprotected on the moon in a spaceship that some places was no thicker than a piece of aluminum foil, and then seeing these ships of vastly superior technology out in front of you. So if this did happen, these men must have been even braver than we actually assumed. So do we have time, Kevin, for just one more little video clip that I have?
Absolutely.
Excellent. So we're going to fast forward to Apollo 17. So what a lot of people don't realize, Apollo 11, the EVA, the extravehicular activity, was only about 2 hours. But by Apollo 17, the last two men officially on the moon, Gene Cernan and Jack Schmitt, who's actually the first ever scientist on the moon, he was a geologist, they actually spent the better part of 3 days on the moon. And once again, they inadvertently caught a UFO sighting on camera. And what's fascinating about it, it seems like Harrison Schmitt, Jack Schmitt, had some knowledge of what was happening, but Gene Cernan seems totally surprised. So I'll play this clip for you, and then everybody can decide on their own what they think.
Marshall's also looking at the possibility of taking a qualm out and seeing if they can take a front fender off and put it on the back there. And they need to know where it broke off in order to see if it's a feasible procedure.
So just to set the stage for you, the two men are trying to repair the fender of the lunar rover. And the camera that we're seeing, NASA is able to actually remotely control from the Earth. So it's going to be panning back and forth. The astronaut that you see with the red stripes on his sleeve is going to be Gene Cernan, the commander. The astronaut in all white is going to be Jack Schmitt.
Okay. Way to go in there. It's not that big.
Okay, why don't you put an SCB? Why don't you put an SCB2 and bring that in instead? Leave SRB out, and then we'll just leave SCB2 in forever.
Okay. Okay, verify SRC plus.
Now, your viewers will need to pay extra attention right up here to the dark space in the sky. You're going to see two objects fly overhead. It's going to be very, very fast.
What are those things going over? What is that, Jack? Hey, something just hit here. What blew? Hey, what is that? Oh, your antenna. It's that styrofoam off the high-gain antenna package. On the LEM? No, the one you deployed. The rover high-gain antenna. My God, it blew up.
So I thought this was a spectacular clip, especially as surprised as Cernan sounds. So I looked for the official explanation, and according to NASA, here's what happened. Anytime you look up close at foam, you know that it's usually soft and squishy because there's so many air pockets. Well, the official story is the antenna foam started inside the pressurized atmosphere of the lunar module. And then when they brought it outside, the vacuum on the moon caused the air pockets to expand and explode. But it's really, really curious to me because usually explosions on a space mission are a bad thing. And so if this was a problem on previous Apollo missions, you would have thought that they would have taken the time to fix it. One last neat tidbit about Apollo 17, Kevin, is the astronaut crews always got the first shot to actually design the mission patch. And what you see here at the bottom, little shout out to the UK here, this is usually considered, or it's called Stonehenge on the Moon. I think it's a beautiful mission patch. It actually shows Stonehenge and the moon and then a beam of light connecting the two. And NASA, actually overruled the astronauts. They thought this was too controversial, and so this mission patch never flew. But some people look at the design of this, and they think that this was the crew's way of trying to tell the public that they were actually there to examine some remnants from older civilizations. So we do have a number of sightings through the space shuttle era and beyond, but I'm guessing that we're starting to run out of time here. So Do you have any questions or comments, Kevin, or how would you like to go from this point forward here?
No. Let's, if we can squeeze it in, let's do that. Let's just talk about the last remaining ones that you've got, because this is just fascinating and people are going to love this. So just let's see.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. Sure. So there is a NASA channel on TV, but for some frustrating reason to me, it is one of the most boring channels there is. I don't see how you can take something as amazing as space flight and make it seem so mundane. And so a lot of times on the channel, it'll basically just be live footage of the cameras rolling. So years ago, they were on the space shuttles, more recently on the International Space Station. And I have two really interesting clips to show your viewers here, and I think that they'll find these really fascinating. So let's start off first back at the space shuttle time. And so let me just set the stage for your viewers here. This is actually when the cameras are just trained on what's called infinity. So their focus is basically adjusted as far out as it can be. There's no actual astronauts that are running the camera at the time. And you can see here that the space shuttle is basically on the nighttime side of the Earth, but you can still see the limb of Earth up above. Now, what your viewers need to be watching in particular is this object right here. When I hit play, you're going to see the object trending to the left. You're then going to see a bright flash down in the atmosphere. The object is suddenly going to change direction, shoot off to the right, and then you're actually going to see something shoot up through the atmosphere at this object. So it's going to be a lot that's going to happen in a short amount of time. So here we go. Object begins trending left. Watch for the flash down below. Flash in the atmosphere, object suddenly changes to the right, and right there you see something shoot up through the atmosphere at it. So here it is again, object moving left, there's the flash, suddenly changes direction, goes right, and there the object comes up at it. And so I always found this to be a fascinating clip, and I looked for the official explanation. And I've seen two things proposed, but both of them I highly question. One explanation is that these were actually dust grains very, very close to the space shuttle. And at some point, one of the astronauts may have fired a thruster that caused the dust grain to change direction. I think that's highly questionable because these cameras are just trained on infinity. And so anything very close to the camera should actually be out of focus. The other explanation that I've seen is that people actually say that it's just a satellite orbiting around the Earth. But I also think that's very questionable because satellites wouldn't suddenly change direction away from the Earth. So I promise this is the last clip I have here. A lot of times UFOs have been caught right on the NASA channel. And I want your viewers to see how this usually gets handled by the space agency. So this is a more recent clip. And this is actually from the International Space Station. And again, camera is trained on infinity. So if you look over to the left, you see what looks like a disc-shaped object very clearly above the blue limb or the atmosphere of the Earth. It starts to rise higher and higher, and it's clearly a distinct disc-shaped object, quite visible. And then you're going to start to see the object fade away, and just watch what happens on the NASA channel when it does. Wait for it. Here it comes. Oh, sorry, we have some technical difficulties there. And this happens more than people realize. There will be a break for technical difficulty, and then they'll come back, and the object, whatever it is, will be totally gone. Interestingly, when I was giving a portion of this presentation at a MUFON conference, an audience member came up afterwards, and they had a fascinating story to share with me about the first object I showed you. They said they were actually personal friends with one of the astronauts who was on board that mission. And all the astronaut would say was, the object was definitely there, and it certainly wasn't a satellite. But beyond that, he could say no more. So here's kind of a neat one to end on. This is somewhat of an urban legend. I'm on the fence on this one, Kevin, but it's kind of neat. These are photographs of what some people have called the Black Knight satellite. And it's been photographed for decades on multiple space missions. And officially, according to NASA, this is likely a thermal blanket that accidentally drifted away from the space shuttle and remained in orbit. But some people believe that this is actually an artificial satellite that was put here by a civilization prior to us to essentially monitor the Earth. If you think back to the Stanley Kubrick film 2001: A Space Odyssey, it would basically be the equivalent of the iconic black monolith that's activated once a civilization gets so advanced. And so it is quite curious, because if it is just a thermal blanket, at some point you'd think it would have burned back up in the atmosphere, but multiple space missions have photographed it. So that's known as the Black Knight. So I do have a second half of this on Mars, but you've been so patient with me, and maybe we can save that for a future time.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation, James. And what would be, finally, an important message to the audience?
We always say on our podcast, keep asking questions. So I think it's really good for people to do their own research anything about science that fascinates you, and look at every avenue you possibly can. So many people on social media, on platforms like Twitter, we sort of mold our reality around us. We only end up following the people who we believe in. And so we never really challenge ourselves, and we just become more deeply ingrained. So I can't say for sure what's happened on these missions, but I can say with absolute certainty that there's definitely a lot more to them than meets the eye, and there's a lot more to them than we know as the public. So hopefully, if you have tuned in and you've watched this presentation, you certainly believe that as well.
Well, James, just thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to getting you back on as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. This was really wonderful. I really appreciate it.